The brick felt warm in Caleb Haynes's hands as he pulled it from the wooden mold, still steaming in the cold Montana air. Around him, stacks of identical bricks lined the riverbank, each one formed from the gray mud beneath his knees. Behind him stood something that shouldn't exist this far into the wilderness. A structure with walls that could withstand anything the mountains threw at it, built entirely from a river, and a technique he wasn't supposed to know. What happened over the next 18 months would make him both a legend and an outcast among mountain men, and the method he used would be suppressed by the very trading companies that controlled the fur trade. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The year was 1839, and Caleb Haynes was breaking the first rule of mountain life: never stay in one place too long. He had been camped along the same bend of the Clark Fork River in western Montana for 3 months, and every trapper who passed his site looked at him like he'd lost his mind. In the fur trade, mobility meant survival. You followed the beaver, worked the trap lines, and moved on before the territory played out or hostiles found your camp. Static camps were targets. Caleb knew this better than most. He had spent 11 years in the Rockies working for the Rocky Mountain Fur Company before going independent 4 seasons back. He understood the rhythms of the trade, the dangers of the wilderness, and the unwritten codes that kept mountain men alive. But he also understood something else, that the traditional way of doing things wasn't the only way. And sometimes survival meant building something permanent rather than running from everything dangerous. His camp didn't look like a typical trapper's setup. Most mountain men threw up a lean-to or a quick log shelter, something that could be abandoned without regret when it was time to move. Caleb had built something different. The foundation was already laid, stone gathered from the riverbed and mortared with clay. Wooden frames stood waiting for walls that didn't exist yet. And every day he spent hours by the river's edge, digging, mixing, forming, and stacking. Other trappers thought he was wasting time. A few thought he'd gone mad from too many winters alone. None of them understood what he was actually doing, because what he was doing wasn't supposed to be possible this far from civilization. Caleb had learned about brickmaking 12 years earlier, long before he ever saw the Rocky Mountains. He'd grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a brick mason who worked the clay pits outside Philadelphia. His father had taught him the trade, how to read clay, judge moisture content, build molds, fire kilns, and create bricks that would last generations. It was skilled labor, passed down through apprenticeships and guild knowledge. Caleb had been good at it. He might have spent his whole life making bricks for Philadelphia's growing buildings if his father hadn't died in a kiln collapse when Caleb was 19. After that, the city felt suffocating. The brickyards reminded him of loss. When he heard about the fortunes being made in western fur, he walked away from everything he knew and headed into the wilderness. For 11 years he trapped beaver and lived like every other mountain man. The winter of 1838 changed everything. Caleb had been holed up in a crude log cabin with 2 other trappers, waiting out a cold snap that lasted nearly 6 weeks. The cabin was poorly built, drafty, and miserable. Ice formed on the inside walls, wind howled through gaps in the chinking. They burned through their firewood twice as fast as expected, just trying to stay above freezing. One of the men, a French-Canadian named Moreau, nearly died from fever brought on by the constant exposure. Caleb spent those 6 weeks thinking about his father's brick buildings back in Philadelphia. Thick walls that held heat in winter and stayed cool in summer. Structures that lasted for decades without major repairs. Buildings that were genuinely secure, not just marginally protective. And he kept thinking about the riverbanks throughout Montana, filled with clay deposits that nobody was using for anything. The idea seemed impossible at first. Brickmaking required infrastructure, proper kilns, fuel sources, time, and safety. Mountain men didn't have any of those things in reliable quantities. But the idea wouldn't leave him alone. By the time spring came and the other trappers headed out to their trap lines, Caleb had made a decision. He was going to try something that no mountain man had ever attempted. He was going to build a brick structure in the wilderness, using nothing but river clay, timber, and the knowledge his father had given him years before. And if it worked, he would never spend another winter freezing in a log cabin that barely kept him alive. The first challenge was finding the right clay. Not all clay was suitable for brickmaking. It needed the proper balance of minerals, the right plasticity, and enough stability to hold shape during firing. Caleb spent 2 weeks in April of 1839 exploring riverbanks along the Clark Fork, testing deposits. He would dig samples, wet them, squeeze them in his fist, and judge the texture. Too sandy, and the bricks would crumble. Too much organic matter, and they would never fire properly. He was looking for smooth, dense clay that held together without being sticky, the kind his father had taught him to recognize by feel alone. He found what he needed about 15 miles upstream from the main trading routes, where the river made a sharp bend and centuries of spring floods had deposited deep clay beds. The clay was gray-brown, fine-grained, and nearly perfect. Caleb grabbed a handful and worked it between his fingers. It had the right consistency, the proper weight. He formed a small ball and let it dry in the sun for an hour, then tried to break it. The dried clay was hard and showed minimal cracking. This would work. This was exactly what he needed. He set up his main camp right there on that riverbank, knowing he was committing to months of stationary work in territory where staying put could get you killed. The second challenge was tools. Back in Philadelphia, brickmakers used specialized equipment: steel spades for digging clay, wire cutters for shaping, wooden molds built to precise dimensions, and established kilns that had been refined over generations. Caleb had none of that. He had a basic knife, a hatchet, a small spade he'd been using for digging cache pits, and whatever he could build from scratch using materials at hand. Caleb spent the first week of May building his brick mold. This single tool would determine the success or failure of everything that followed. A poorly made mold would produce irregular bricks that wouldn't stack properly or fire evenly. His father had always said that brickmaking was 10% clay and 90% precision. Caleb found a stand of straight-grained pine about a mile from camp and selected 4 pieces that were as close to identical as he could find. He spent 2 days shaping them with his hatchet and knife, creating boards roughly 2 inches thick, 10 inches long, and 4 inches wide. The dimensions weren't arbitrary. They matched the standard brick size his father had used, a ratio that provided structural stability and efficient stacking. He joined the boards at the corners using wooden pegs carved from harder oak, creating a rectangular frame with no bottom. The joints had to be tight enough to prevent wet clay from leaking, but loose enough to allow the mold to be lifted away cleanly. When he finished, Caleb held the mold up to eye level and checked the alignment. It wasn't perfect. The corners weren't quite square, and one side was slightly thicker than the others, but it would work. It had to work. He carved his initials into one corner of the frame, a habit from his apprentice days. Every brickmaker marked their molds. It was tradition, a small claim of craftsmanship in an anonymous trade. Caleb had no idea whether anyone else would ever see these bricks or know who made them, but the ritual mattered. It connected him to his father, to Philadelphia, to a life that felt impossibly distant from this Montana riverbank. The challenge now was preparing the clay itself. Raw clay straight from the riverbank wasn't ready for brickmaking. It contained rocks, roots, and inconsistent moisture that would ruin the firing process. Caleb dug out approximately 200 pounds of clay and spread it on a flat area he'd cleared near the water's edge. He spent an entire afternoon breaking apart clumps with his hands, removing stones and organic debris, and working the clay into a uniform consistency. His hands cramped from the repetitive motion. Clay worked its way under his fingernails and into every crack in his skin. This was the part of brickmaking he'd forgotten during his years in the mountains, how physically brutal the work actually was. Once the clay was cleaned, Caleb added water from the river, a little at a time, mixing constantly until he achieved the right texture. Too wet, and the bricks would slump when he tried to unmold them. Too dry, and they would crack during the drying phase. He was looking for clay that held its shape when squeezed, but didn't stick aggressively to his hands. The consistency had to be perfect. After an hour of mixing and adjusting, he finally had a batch that felt right. He scooped up enough clay to fill his wooden mold, pressed it firmly into every corner, then smoothed the top with a flat piece of bark. This was the moment of truth. Caleb lifted the mold straight up, slowly and carefully. The wet brick held its shape. The corners stayed sharp. The sides remained vertical. He set the mold aside and looked at what he'd created. One brick, sitting on the ground, perfect in form, if not yet in durability. Making one brick was an accomplishment. Making enough bricks to build anything useful was a different challenge entirely. Caleb estimated he would need at least 800 bricks for even a modest structure with walls thick enough to provide real protection. At 1 brick every 10 minutes, working from sunrise to sunset, that meant weeks of continuous labor before he could even think about firing them. And that was assuming none of them cracked during drying, none failed during firing, and he didn't make any mistakes that would force him to start over. The math was daunting, but Caleb had learned patience during his years in the mountains. Trapping taught you to work slowly and carefully, because rushing got you killed or left you with ruined pelts worth nothing. He established a routine. Every morning, he would dig fresh clay from the riverbank and spend an hour cleaning and preparing it. Then he would begin forming bricks, one after another, placing each carefully on a flat drying area he'd prepared using smooth stones. By mid-afternoon, his hands would be raw and his back would ache from the constant bending and lifting, but he kept working. The wet bricks sat gleaming in the sun, rows of them stretching across his camp like a strange crop that nobody had ever planted before. After 2 weeks, Caleb had formed nearly 200 bricks. They filled every flat surface around his camp, drying slowly in the mountain air. But drying brought new problems. Some bricks cracked as moisture left the clay too quickly. Others warped slightly, developing curves that would make them useless for construction. Caleb learned to cover the bricks with damp cloth during the hottest part of the day, slowing the drying process to prevent stress fractures. He learned to rotate them regularly so they dried evenly on all sides. He learned which bricks were salvageable despite minor flaws and which needed to be broken up and returned to the clay pile. The failure rate was higher than he'd hoped. Out of those first 200 bricks, only about 140 were good enough to use. That meant he would need to make even more than he'd originally calculated. The physical toll was substantial. Caleb's hands developed calluses on top of calluses. His shoulders ached constantly from the repetitive motion of lifting and placing. He lost weight despite eating well, the labor burning through calories faster than he could replace them. But there was something deeply satisfying about the work. Each brick represented progress. Each row of drying bricks was proof that his impossible idea was actually working. He was creating building materials from nothing but mud and effort, using knowledge that most mountain men didn't even know existed. By early June, Caleb had approximately 400 usable bricks drying in the sun, half of what he needed, but enough to start thinking seriously about the next phase: firing. Without proper firing, the bricks were just dried mud. They would dissolve in rain and crumble under pressure. The kiln was everything, and Caleb didn't have one. He would have to build it from scratch, using materials at hand, in a design that would reach temperatures hot enough to transform clay into stone. The kiln was the most critical piece of infrastructure Caleb would build, and also the most dangerous. His father had worked with established brick kilns that had been refined over generations, massive structures that could fire thousands of bricks at once with consistent results. Caleb had none of that. He would have to improvise something that could reach temperatures above 1800 degrees and maintain that heat for hours without collapsing or causing a catastrophic failure that could destroy everything he'd worked for. The design he settled on was called a stove kiln, a temporary structure built from the unfired bricks themselves, stacked in a specific pattern that allowed heat to circulate while containing it efficiently. He started by selecting a flat area about 30 yards from the river, far enough to avoid moisture but close enough to access water if things went wrong. The ground needed to be absolutely level. Any tilt would cause uneven heat distribution and ruin the firing. Caleb spent 2 days with a makeshift level, adjusting the ground until it met his standards. Then he began stacking unfired bricks in a rectangular pattern, leaving gaps between them to allow airflow. The gaps were crucial. Fire needed oxygen to burn hot enough for proper firing, but too much air would cool the bricks too quickly. The spacing had to be precise. The base layer consisted of approximately 60 bricks arranged in rows with finger-width gaps between each one. On top of that, Caleb built walls 4 bricks thick, creating a chamber in the center where he would stack the majority of bricks to be fired. The walls needed to be thick enough to contain heat, but porous enough to allow combustion gases to escape. He left small openings at the base where he could feed fuel into the fire chamber. The entire structure stood about 5 feet tall when completed, a beehive shape that looked fragile but was actually quite stable. The unfired bricks held together through careful stacking and their own weight, creating a temporary kiln that would either transform them into permanent building materials or collapse into useless rubble. Inside the central chamber, Caleb stacked approximately 300 bricks that were fully dried and ready for firing. He arranged them with small gaps between each one, ensuring heat could reach every surface. The stacking pattern mattered enormously. Bricks too close together wouldn't fire evenly. Bricks too far apart would waste heat and fuel. Caleb worked slowly, adjusting and readjusting until the arrangement felt right. This was the gamble. If the firing failed, he would lose weeks of work and have to start over. If it succeeded, he would have genuine bricks that could withstand weather, impacts, and time. The fuel source was the next problem. Brick firing required sustained high temperatures for at least 12 hours, possibly longer. That meant an enormous amount of wood, far more than he would normally use in a month of regular campfires. Caleb spent 3 days gathering deadfall timber from the surrounding forest, dragging logs back to camp until he had a pile that stood taller than himself. It still didn't feel like enough, but it would have to do. Caleb started the fire on a calm morning in mid-June when the wind was minimal and the sky was clear. Wind could disrupt the firing process, creating uneven temperatures that would ruin bricks. Rain would be catastrophic. He needed perfect conditions, and this was as close as he was likely to get. He built a small fire in the fuel chamber at the base of the kiln using dry kindling and small branches, letting it establish itself before adding larger pieces. The key was gradual heat increase. If the temperature rose too quickly, moisture trapped inside the bricks would turn to steam and cause them to explode. His father had called them shooters, bricks that literally shot fragments across the work area when internal pressure became too great. Caleb had seen it happen during his apprenticeship, dangerous and wasteful. For the first 4 hours, he kept the fire small and steady, slowly driving moisture from the bricks without stressing them. Smoke rose from gaps in the kiln walls, turning from white to gray as the temperature increased. Caleb fed the fire constantly, adding wood in careful increments, never letting it grow too large or too small. The work was hypnotic and exhausting. He couldn't leave the kiln unattended. Every moment mattered. By afternoon, the kiln was radiating serious heat. Caleb could feel it from 10 feet away, a shimmer in the air that made the surrounding forest seem to waver. He increased the fuel supply, building the fire hotter and hotter, pushing toward the temperatures necessary for true vitrification. As evening came, the gaps in the kiln walls began to glow dull red. That was the sign Caleb had been waiting for. The bricks were reaching transformation temperature, the point where clay minerals began to fuse and create the hardness that defined real bricks. He kept the fire roaring, feeding log after log into the chambers, maintaining that critical heat through the night. The forest around him disappeared into darkness, but the kiln glowed like a small sun, casting flickering orange light across his camp. Sparks rose into the night sky. The heat was so intense that Caleb had to approach the fuel opening sideways, shielding his face with his arm as he threw wood into the flames. By midnight, he had burned through more than half his wood supply. His eyes stung from smoke, his arms ached from the constant lifting and throwing. But he couldn't stop. The firing process required sustained high heat, and any significant temperature drop would compromise the entire batch. He kept working through exhaustion, through the cold hours before dawn, when his body wanted nothing more than sleep. The kiln had become the center of his universe, a glowing structure that represented months of effort and the hope of something better than the miserable shelters that killed trappers every winter. As the sun rose on the second day, Caleb fed the last of his wood into the fire and watched the flames slowly diminish. The kiln had been firing for nearly 20 hours. Now came the hardest part, waiting for it to cool slowly enough that the bricks wouldn't crack from thermal shock. Caleb couldn't touch the kiln for 3 full days. The structure radiated heat like a banked forge, too hot to approach closely and far too hot to dismantle. He spent those days gathering more wood, preparing more clay, and trying not to think about what he might find when he finally opened the kiln. The uncertainty was maddening. He had no way to know if the firing had worked until he could examine the bricks directly. They might be perfectly vitrified, hard as stone, and ready for construction. Or they might be overfired and warped, underfired and weak, or cracked from uneven heating. 3 days of waiting felt longer than the 3 months he'd already invested in the project. On the morning of the 4th day, the kiln had cooled enough to touch without burning his hands. Caleb began carefully dismantling the outer walls, removing unfired bricks that had served as the kiln structure itself. These bricks were ruined, partially melted, and fused together from the extreme heat. That was expected. They were sacrificial, serving only to contain the fire that would transform the bricks stacked inside. As he worked deeper into the structure, removing layer after layer, his anticipation grew. The central chamber was still warm, but no longer dangerous. When he finally reached the first row of fired bricks, Caleb pulled one free and held it up to the morning light. The brick had transformed. What had been gray-brown river clay was now a deep orange-red, the color of fired terracotta. The surface was hard, genuinely hard. Not the fragile hardness of dried mud, but the stone-like density of proper ceramic. Caleb struck it against another brick and heard a clear ringing sound, the note that brickmakers called singing. That sound meant vitrification had occurred, that the clay minerals had fused into a permanent matrix that would resist water, weather, and time. He examined the brick closely for cracks, checking edges and corners. It was perfect, not a single flaw. He set it aside and pulled another brick from the kiln, also perfect, and another, also good. As Caleb worked through the stack, pulling brick after brick from the cooling kiln, he realized that the firing had been remarkably successful. Out of the 300 bricks he'd loaded, approximately 270 had fired properly with no significant defects. That was a success rate better than he'd dared hope for, especially on a first attempt with an improvised kiln in the middle of the wilderness. The remaining 30 bricks showed various problems. Some were cracked, some had warped slightly, and a few on the outer edges hadn't reached high enough temperatures for complete vitrification. But the core of the firing, the bricks that had been surrounded by optimal heat, were exactly what he needed. Caleb stacked the good bricks carefully, creating rows organized by quality. The best bricks would be used for corners and structural elements. The slightly imperfect ones could be used for less critical areas. Even the failed bricks weren't worthless. He could crush them and use the fragments as aggregate in mortar. By late July, Caleb had completed 4 successful firings and accumulated nearly 900 usable bricks. His camp had transformed into something that looked more like a frontier brickyard than a trapper's temporary shelter. Stacks of finished bricks stood in organized rows. The foundation he'd laid months earlier was finally ready to receive walls. But as Caleb prepared to begin actual construction, he received his first visitor in weeks, and the conversation that followed revealed just how controversial his methods had become among the mountain men who controlled the fur trade. The visitor was a trapper named Marcus Webb, a company man who worked for the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and traveled the territory, checking on independent trappers and ensuring they weren't violating company protocols. Marcus rode into camp on a tired mule, took one look at the brick stacks and partially built structure, and his face darkened with something between confusion and anger. He dismounted without greeting Caleb and walked slowly around the construction site, examining everything with the intensity of someone looking for evidence of a crime. When he finally spoke, his tone was cold and official. Marcus explained something Caleb hadn't fully considered. The fur trade operated on established rules, most of them unwritten but rigorously enforced. Trappers were supposed to be mobile, working defined territories without creating permanent infrastructure that might attract settlement or competition. The trading companies wanted the mountains to remain wild and undeveloped, preserving them as exclusive trapping grounds for as long as possible. Permanent structures suggested permanence, and permanence suggested settlement, and settlement meant the end of the fur trade's control over Western territories. What Caleb was building represented a threat to the entire system, even if he didn't intend it that way. A brick structure could last decades. It could be occupied by multiple families. It suggested that someone could actually live in the mountains year-round in comfort and safety, which contradicted the narrative that the wilderness was too dangerous for anyone except tough, mobile trappers who accepted company authority. Marcus didn't threaten Caleb directly, but he made the situation clear. The company wouldn't explicitly stop him from building, but they wouldn't help him either. No other trappers would be allowed to learn his methods. No trading post would sell him supplies if they knew what he was doing. and if hostile Blackfoot discovered his static camp and attacked, the company wouldn't consider it their responsibility to help or avenge him. Caleb was being isolated, cut off from the support systems that made mountain life survivable. Marcus delivered this information matter-of-factly, as if explaining simple economics rather than issuing threats, then mounted his mule and rode away without another word. Caleb stood alone in his camp, surrounded by 900 bricks that suddenly felt like evidence against him. He understood the politics now. His innovation wasn't just unusual, it was threatening to people who had invested fortunes in maintaining the fur trade structure. But he'd already come too far to stop. The bricks were made, the foundation was laid, and winter would come regardless of what the trading companies wanted. Caleb began laying bricks in early August, working alone and methodically. The construction process was actually simpler than the brickmaking had been. His father's training guided every movement: spread mortar, place brick, check level, tap to seat, repeat. The mortar was made from the same river clay he'd used for bricks, mixed with sand and a small amount of animal fat for workability. It wasn't as good as lime mortar, but it would hold the structure together adequately. The walls rose slowly, one course at a time, each layer adding weight and stability to the ones below. Caleb built the structure small by necessity, just 12 feet by 16 feet, with walls 2 bricks thick for strength and insulation. The double wall construction created a barrier that would hold heat far better than any log cabin could manage. By mid-September, the wall stood 6 feet high, and Caleb faced the challenge of creating a roof. Brick buildings traditionally used wooden roof structures, but Caleb wanted something more permanent. He decided on a barrel vault, an arched roof built entirely from brick that would be self-supporting once completed. It was ambitious, possibly too ambitious for one man working alone, but Caleb had watched his father build vaulted cellars and understood the principles. He constructed a wooden form, a temporary curved structure that would support the bricks until the mortar set and the arch became self-supporting. Then he began laying bricks in a curved pattern, working from both sides toward the center, each brick cut at a slight angle to follow the arch. The vault took 3 weeks to complete, and there were moments when Caleb thought the entire structure might collapse before the mortar could cure. But his father's techniques held true. When he finally removed the wooden support form, the brick arch remained solid, supporting its own weight through the physics of compression and carefully calculated angles. Caleb stood inside his completed structure and looked up at the curved brick ceiling, and for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, he felt like he'd created something that would genuinely last. The building had no windows yet, just openings he would later cover with shutters. The door was a heavy timber frame that sealed tightly against the brick opening. The floor was packed earth, though Caleb had plans to eventually pave it with brick as well. The first test came in late September when an early storm rolled through the mountains, bringing 3 days of cold rain that would have made a log cabin miserable. Caleb sat inside his brick structure, completely dry, with a small fire providing warmth that the thick walls held and radiated long after the flames died down. The temperature inside remained stable, even as the temperature outside dropped near freezing. No wind penetrated the walls. No rain leaked through the vaulted ceiling. The structure performed exactly as Caleb had hoped it would, providing a level of protection and comfort that no trapper in the region had ever experienced. It was shelter that approached what people in cities took for granted, built in the wilderness using nothing but river mud and knowledge. Winter came hard that year, arriving in early November with temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks. Caleb spent those months inside his brick structure, warm and secure, while other trappers struggled in their drafty log cabins or abandoned their camps entirely and retreated to trading posts. He had proven what he set out to prove, that proper construction techniques could transform frontier living from mere survival into something approaching comfort. But the success of his experiment had unintended consequences that extended far beyond his isolated camp on the Clark Fork River. Word spread slowly through the trapping community despite the trading company's attempts to suppress it. Trappers who had seen Caleb's structure told others, describing a building that stayed warm in winter, dry in storms, and secure against bears and other threats. Some dismissed the stories as exaggeration. Others became intensely curious, asking questions about how such a thing was possible. A few began experimenting with clay and brick making themselves, though most lacked the technical knowledge to succeed. The trading companies watched this development with growing concern, recognizing that permanent structures threatened their control over the mountains and the trappers who worked them. Caleb lived in his brick house for 2 more years, trapping during spring and fall, processing pelts, and gradually adding improvements to his structure. He built a proper fireplace with a brick chimney that drew smoke efficiently. He paved the floor with brick, creating a surface that was cleanable and held no moisture. He added shuttered windows that could be sealed completely in winter or opened in summer. The structure became increasingly refined, approaching the quality of buildings back east, while remaining isolated in wilderness that most people considered uninhabitable. But Caleb never built another brick structure, and he never taught his methods to other trappers who asked. The isolation Marcus Webb had promised became real, and Caleb eventually understood that his innovation, while successful, had made him an outsider in the community he'd once been part of. In the spring of 1842, Caleb dismantled his trapping equipment, packed his belongings, and left Montana for good. The brick structure remained, abandoned but intact, standing as evidence of what one man with knowledge and determination could accomplish. In the following decades, other trappers occasionally occupied the building, sheltering from storms or using it as a cache for supplies. Settlers moving west in later years discovered it and marveled at its construction, wondering who had built such a thing so far from civilization. The structure stood for more than 30 years before finally succumbing to neglect and the slow work of weather on unmaintained mortar. The story of Caleb Haynes illustrates how innovation can be both successful and threatening, solving real problems while disrupting established systems that benefit from those problems remaining unsolved. His method of turning river mud into brick walls proved that frontier living didn't have to mean constant discomfort and danger, but that same proof threatened people invested in maintaining frontier harshness. Sometimes the impossible becomes possible, not because the technique is discovered, but because someone finally refuses to accept that traditional suffering is inevitable.